On the night of September 19th to 20th, 1961, 42-year-old Betty Hill raised her binoculars to her eyes and saw something in the sky that, by all laws of physics, could not have been there. 2 hours later, she could not remember a thing. 3 weeks later, she stopped sleeping, and what eventually surfaced from the void of her memory caused military analysts, psychiatrists, and ufologists from around the world to debate the nature of reality for the next 6 decades. Thank you for watching our videos. Many of you watch without subscribing, and we'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. For you, it's just one click, but for us, it's a day filled with joy knowing we're creating awesome content. Enjoy the video. Betty Hill, née Barrett, was born in 1919 in the state of New Hampshire. By the fall of 1961, she was 42. She worked as a social worker for the State Department of Health, a calm, methodical job dealing with paperwork, families, and children in difficult circumstances. Colleagues described her as a practical person, prone to precise phrasing and averse to fantasies. She kept notebooks, loved having her closets organized, and made sure there was always milk in the fridge. Barney Hill was a few years younger than his wife. He had just turned 39. He worked at the post office in Portsmouth and was an energetic, sociable, and active member of the state governor's local Human Rights Council. They got married in 1960, one of the first interracial marriages in the county. Betty was white, Barney was African American. They were a prominent couple. They didn't hide or shy away. They spoke at meetings and lived openly. Both were mature, accomplished adults with no penchant for drama. They knew their car well, a dark blue 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, a reliable, somewhat noisy vehicle on uphill climbs, which Barney treated with care and serviced regularly. In early September 1961, they took a short vacation to Canada, the province of Quebec, Niagara Falls, for a few quiet days without phones or meetings. On September 19th, they set out back to Portsmouth. The route was the usual one, Route 3 through the White Mountains of New Hampshire, a road they knew well. It was a clear autumn day. The leaves were already beginning to turn red at the edges. They left Montreal in the morning, had lunch at a roadside restaurant in Colebrook. Barney ordered tea, Betty ordered coffee and a turkey sandwich. According to her later testimony, nothing seemed out of the ordinary that day. They talked about work, about autumn, and about needing to stop by Betty's sister's place the following week. Around 7 in the evening, they crossed the state line at Landsborough. The sky began to darken. In New Hampshire, it gets dark quickly in the fall. First, the sky turns blue over the mountains, then it engulfs the valleys, and the road remains only within the beam of the headlights. Route 3 wound between the hills, with pine trees on both sides. There were almost no cars. Around 10:15 p.m., somewhere near Lancaster, Betty noticed a bright object in the sky. At first, she thought it was a star, but the star was moving. She asked Barney to stop. He pulled over to the side of the road. Betty got out of the car and raised her binoculars, a pair of 8x Bushnell binoculars they'd brought along for birdwatching. The object was brighter than Jupiter and changed direction smoothly, without momentum, not in an arc like an airplane, but sideways, as if turning in place. At first, Barney assumed it was an artificial satellite or a military aircraft from PS Air Force Base in the neighboring state. They drove on, but the object followed them. They stopped 2 more times. The second time was near Zephyr Lake, where Barney also took out his binoculars. According to his account, the object descended. It became clear that it was neither a fire nor a reflection. It was a structure, flat, disc-shaped, with a row of lights around the perimeter that rotated slowly. Barney counted about 11 lights. The object hovered above them. North of the town of Woodstock, about 20 kilometers south of Lincoln, Barney stopped the car again, right in the middle of the road. The object descended low. He later estimated the distance to be 30 meters above the ground, no more. Barney got out of the car and walked into the field at the edge of the road, continuing to look through his binoculars. What he saw in the next few seconds changed everything that followed. In the windows, or what he took to be windows, he made out silhouettes, several figures. They were looking at him. He later said that he felt something specific, not fear of the unknown, but fear of contact, of being seen and studied in return. One of the silhouettes stood apart from the others, closer to the edge. Barney screamed. Betty heard it from the car and ran back. At that moment, they both heard a sound. Not the hum of an engine, not a rumble. A series of rhythmic metallic clicks, as if someone were tapping a key against the car's body from the outside. one after another, at short intervals. Betty described the sensation as a vibration that traveled upward through the seat from below. Then it all vanished. The next thing they both clearly remember is driving down the highway. Barney is at the wheel. Betty is looking out the window. A road sign reads, Ashland, 12 miles. They're both slightly confused, not understanding why they're driving slower than usual or where this fatigue is coming from. They try to remember what happened between the flashes and now, and can't. It's not that they've forgotten. It's just that there's nothing there, like a page torn out of a book. They reached Portsmouth around 5 in the morning. Their usual route from Woodstock to Portsmouth took about 3 hours, and they were supposed to arrive no later than 2 in the morning. But the clock read just past 6. They had lost more than 2 hours of actual time and couldn't explain where. The road from Woodstock to Ashland is about 55 kilometers as the crow flies, but they didn't remember it. They didn't remember a single turn, a single intersection, or a single village. At home, everything seemed normal, and that was precisely what was abnormal. While changing clothes, Barney discovered that the soles of his boots, almost new, bought 3 weeks ago, were worn down at the front, as if he'd been walking on his toes for a long time or dragging someone along. There were spots on the Chevrolet's metal body, oval, shiny, each about the size of a quarter, clustered in groups of 3 or 4 along the trunk. The compass Barney kept in the glove compartment acted strangely near these spots. The needle spun non-stop. Betty noticed something odd about her Sunday dress, a dark blue cotton one she'd bought in Montreal. The fabric wasn't snagged or torn along a thread. It had been cut cleanly, as if with surgical scissors, along the entire length of the right side seam. The clock had stopped. Barney's wristwatch, an automatic mechanical watch that didn't need winding, showed 11:15. The wall clock in the kitchen, an old pendulum clock they'd inherited from Grandma, had also stopped. Betty checked. The pendulum was in the neutral position. The spring wasn't wound, even though Barney had wound them before leaving 3 days ago. It was as if time in the house had simply stopped at some point during the night and hadn't moved on. In the early days, they hardly spoke of it. Barney blamed the fatigue on the long drive. Betty called her sister Janet and gave her a general account. Janet was skeptical, but 10 days later, the dreams began. They came to Betty every night in the same order, like episodes of a single story. In the first dream, she is standing on the road, and the road is blocked. Not by a pileup, not by an accident, just blocked. The people standing across the road are short, with large round heads, and they stare silently. In the second dream, she is led inside something, down a staircase, then down a corridor with curved walls. The light is dim and cold. In the third, a room resembling a doctor's office, but without corners. She is asked to lie down. They do something to her neck and stomach. She feels no pain, but senses a presence. The creature stands nearby and looks at her. It has no mouth in the usual sense, just a thin line that doesn't move. It says something to her, but she doesn't hear the words. She understands the meaning directly, as if the words bypass her ears. Betty wrote down her dreams every morning, neatly, dating the pages. By the end of September, she had a notebook of over 20 pages. Barney, on the other hand, remembered almost nothing, and that frightened him more than if he had dreamed of something specific. He would wake up with the feeling that something had happened, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Health problems began to surface, an ulcer he'd never had before, insomnia, and anxiety he couldn't quite put into words. In the spring of 1962, on the advice of their therapist, they turned to a psychiatrist. Dr. Duncan Stevens of Portsmouth saw them in March. He didn't specialize in anything unusual, just general practice, stress, family conflicts, post-war disorders. But he was thorough. He conducted separate sessions with them, first speaking with Barney, then with Betty, then again. He found no pathology in the conventional sense. They were not mentally ill. They did not suffer from hallucinations in between recounting that night. Their accounts were internally consistent. Stevens recommended continued observation and, if necessary, hypnotherapy. In December 1963, more than 2 years after that night, Betty and Barney turned to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist and hypnosis specialist from Boston. Simon had a solid reputation. He worked with World War II veterans suffering from dissociative disorders and used regressive hypnosis to recover traumatic memories. He was a skeptic. He didn't believe in UFOs, but he believed in the method. The sessions began in January 1964. Barney and Betty were put into a trance separately at different times and were not allowed to discuss the content of the sessions with each other until they were over. This was a standard precaution to rule out mutual suggestion. Simon recorded the sessions on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Under hypnosis, Barney spoke slowly and with effort, like a man recalling something through pain. He described the moment the car stopped. He got out and walked toward the object. Not of his own volition, he emphasized. I was walking, but I didn't decide to go on my own. He was lifted, not by a rope, not physically. He described the sensation as if gravity had changed direction, and he found himself inside. The corridor had a low ceiling, about 1.8 meters high, with gray walls. He was led into a room and asked to lie down on a table. The beings were short, about 5 feet tall, with large heads and big, elongated eyes. He said, their eyes stared straight ahead and didn't blink. They took a skin scraping from his wrist. He felt pressure but no pain. He was asked to open his mouth. One of them picked up something resembling a metal cylinder and held it to his ear. Under hypnosis, Betty described the same sequence with different details that could not have been suggested by his words because the sessions took place at different times. She spoke of a needle, long, thin, and metal. It was inserted into her abdomen through her navel. The being explained to her, again without words, through direct understanding, that this was a pregnancy test. Later, doctors who studied her testimony noted, in 1961, laparoscopy, puncturing the abdominal wall through the navel, was a procedure virtually unknown to the general public. It was not until the 1970s that it began to be used in gynecology. Betty couldn't have known that. She also described a map. The being showed her an image, she called it three-dimensional, floating in the air. The map was marked with dots and lines, some dotted, others solid. She asked what they were. She was told they were trade routes and expedition lines. When she asked where they were, the being gestured to a single point. Under hypnosis, she reproduced the map from memory, a freehand sketch, 12 points connected by lines. In 1968, Marjorie Fish, an astronomy teacher from Ohio, began systematic work to identify these points. She constructed a three-dimensional model of the nearest stars using the Gliese catalog, a reference guide to the 1,000 nearest star systems. In 1969, Fish found a match. Betty's drawing corresponded to the position of the Zeta Reticuli star system, a binary star in the constellation Reticulum, 39 light-years from Earth. The match was deemed statistically significant by a number of astronomers. Others disputed the methodology. The question remains open to this day. Upon returning home, several small round marks appeared on Betty's stomach, symmetrically arranged, 3 on each side of her navel. She didn't think much of them. She decided they were insect bites, but they didn't go away. A few weeks later, the family doctor examined them and could not explain their origin. The edges were smooth, there was no inflammation, but the depth of the damage to the subcutaneous layer was not typical of a bite. On Barney, the marks remained on the back of his neck, 2 parallel stripes, slightly raised, like burn scars, but cold to the touch. He didn't remember them being there before the trip. His new doctor, general practitioner Herbert Prescott in Portsmouth, recorded them in his medical chart in October 1961, 3 weeks after the trip, and noted without comment, origin unknown. Dr. Simon concluded the sessions in June 1964. His final conclusion was cautious and, by the standards of the scientific community, unprecedented. He found no signs of malingering, psychosis, or deliberate deception. The accounts were given in a state of deep trance, were consistent with one another in key details, and differed in minor details, exactly as is the case with real memories. Simon, however, proposed a tentative explanation. Barney might have absorbed the content of Betty's dreams, which she recorded aloud, while asleep, and then reproduced them under hypnosis as his own memories. This explanation satisfied few. It did not explain the amniocentesis. It did not explain the map. It did not explain the stains on the car. It did not explain the worn-out soles of the boots or the torn dress. The story became public in October 1965, when journalist John Fuller of the Saturday Review published the first in-depth article based on interviews with the Hills. In 1966, Fuller published the book The Interrupted Journey, the first detailed documentary study of the case. The book became a bestseller. The Hills began to be invited to conferences, television shows, and universities. They agreed to speak on one condition: Only facts, only what had been recorded. The military reacted with restraint. The headquarters of Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire confirmed that it had recorded an unidentified object in the White Mountains area that night. One of the radar operators, Sergeant Eugene Roman, reported in a private conversation with researcher Stanton Friedman in the 1970s that the object was moving at a speed of several thousand kilometers per hour and performing maneuvers impossible for any known aircraft. This statement was never officially confirmed. Sergeant Roman died in 1983, leaving no written testimony. The U.S. Air Force Command conducted a formal investigation as part of Project Blue Book. Conclusion: the incident was classified as a psychological phenomenon. No search of the highway, no forensic examination of marks on the car, no analysis of marks on the bodies. The case was closed within a few months. Investigator Stanton Friedman, a former nuclear physicist who worked on the development of reactors for nuclear submarines in the 1960s, studied the classified Blue Book documents released under the Freedom of Information Act in 1976 and concluded none of the official explanations took into account the specific physical evidence documented during the first weeks after the incident. Psychiatrist James McDonald of the University of Arizona, one of the few scientists who studied the case materials without a preconceived position, stated explicitly in his 1968 report to the Congressional Committee on Science and Astronautics, "The Hill case represents a documented example of a phenomenon that defies any of the available explanations, while maintaining the internal consistency of all witness testimony." His report was heard and ignored. In the years that followed, several independent researchers attempted to retrace the route. In 1974, a group of 4 people, led by Walter Nugent, a journalist from Boston, drove Route 3 in the same direction, at the same time of day, and during the same season. They marked the spot where, according to Barney's account, he stopped the car. The shoulder widens here, there is room to pull over. The field to the left of the road is flat and clearly visible. Nugent noted, "At this spot, there is not a single source of artificial light as far as the eye can see. A dark spot, an ideal vantage point, and an ideal spot from which you are completely visible." Barney Hill died on February 25, 1969, from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 46 years old. His health had deteriorated sharply in recent years. His ulcer had caused complications. His blood pressure rose for no apparent reason, and he became more withdrawn, though outwardly he continued to work and meet with people. Colleagues said that after 1961, something had changed in him, something profound, something unnameable. He didn't like to talk about it. He would only say, "It happened," and nothing more. Betty outlived her husband by 35 years. After his death, she continued to give lectures, participate in conferences, and grant interviews. She never recanted her testimony. She never added any new details. She said what she had said from the very first day, in the same words, not theatrical, not persuasive, just precise, like someone who remembers exactly what happened. She died on October 17, 2004, at the age of 85, at her home in Portsmouth. Her funeral was attended by researchers, skeptics, journalists, and strangers who had traveled from other states without knowing her personally, simply because what had happened to her had changed them too. The Dream Journal is kept under special conditions at the University of New Hampshire. The tape recordings of the sessions with Dr. Simon were donated by his family to the archives in 1998. The marks on the car were never identified. Barney sold the Chevrolet in 1965 before anyone had a chance to perform a chemical analysis of the traces. Betty kept the stain on her dress, the one with the slit. It still exists today. Material scientists who examined the fabric in 1980 were unable to determine what tool had made the cut. The edges were too straight for scissors and too smooth for a blade. The official position has not changed. A psychological phenomenon. There are no grounds for reopening the case. There is no new evidence requiring a review. But there are several details that no official explanation has seen fit to include in its review. First, the compass in the Chevrolet's glove compartment was spinning erratically near the stains on the body. Then Barney moved it to another compartment, farther away from the spots. A few days later, the compass was working normally again. A few weeks later, Barney discovered that the spots on the body were slowly disappearing. They weren't washing off, they were actually disappearing, as if the metal beneath them were returning to its original state. Second, that same night, from the 19th to the 20th of September, several other drivers on Route 3 reported strange lights in the sky. Only one of them did so officially, Clarence Newman, a truck driver from Bristol, who filed a report at the Grafton County Police Station. The report was accepted, logged, and disappeared from the archives a few weeks later. The station employee who took the report, Duty Officer Harold Murphy, said in an interview in the 1970s that he did not remember the document and could not explain where it might have gone. Third, for several years after the incident, Betty continued to record strange phenomena in the vicinity of Portsmouth. Lights above the highway, unexpectedly empty roads at night. She recorded her observations in a separate journal. Not once did she photograph anything. She said that by the time she managed to get her camera out, everything had vanished. One entry in the journal, dated July 1966, stands out from the rest. It is brief. The same road again, the same place again. I stopped. I looked up. I saw nothing, but I was sure that I was being seen. That is what will remain unanswered. Not what exactly was hovering over Highway 3 that autumn night, not who is standing behind the rounded windows, but what happens to a person who has once realized they are being watched closely, watched right through. And once that certainty takes hold, it never leaves. So what happened on Route 3 that night, when two ordinary people were driving home from vacation and could not recall 2 hours of their lives? Why did a map drawn under hypnosis by a housewife from New Hampshire in 1964 match an astronomical catalog compiled 5 years later? Where did Clarence Newman's report go? And what does it mean to remember something you didn't consciously experience? These are questions without answers. For now, without answers.